The relationship between God and Zeus, iconic figures in different religious traditions, can be analyzed taking into account their characteristics and attributions. God, from a monotheistic perspective, is considered a supreme being, omnipotent, omniscient, and often the representation of absolute good. On the other hand, Zeus, who is a central figure in Greek mythology, is recognized as the king of the gods of the Greek pantheon, representing the sky and thunder, but also demonstrating human traits such as anger and passion. These two characters reflect the diversity of divine conceptions throughout human history. Thus, while God symbolizes a unity and transcendental morality, Zeus, in turn, exemplifies the plurality and complexity of divinities that characterized ancient mythology, where gods were often portrayed with flaws and virtues, albeit in different frameworks. In this way, we can see that both share the role of being divine figures, but are based on very different cultural contexts and beliefs. These words are very similar to each other, with characteristics that make them quite similar in form and, possibly, in meaning. However, is this a mere coincidence, or is there a direct connection that can be established between these two names? So, yes, there is a direct relationship, and a very deep one that is very interesting, because in order to explain this relationship between Zeus and God, we must necessarily go through some questions that will certainly radically change your way of thinking about the history of religions. The relationship between Zeus and God, and to begin this explanation of what lies behind the similarity between the names God and Zeus, it's worth comparing two other names, Zeus and Jupiter. You may have heard that the god the Greeks called Zeus was the same god the Romans called Jupiter. Both names refer to a god of the sky, of lightning and storms, sovereign over the other gods, associated with the eagle, the oak tree, and so on. But the thing is much more interesting than that, because it's not simply that Zeus and Jupiter are different names used to talk about the same god. In fact, at root, Zeus and Jupiter are also the same name. Jupiter in Latin is Jupiter, and this name can be divided into two parts. The second part, Pitter, coming from exactly the same root as pater pi in Latin, including another Italic deity, sometimes also identified as Jupiter himself, who was called Dipit or Dipat, literally father of the day. And one of the various ways of referring to Zeus in ancient Greece was Zoopater, which is the sound of zeta. The first letter of Zeus in the oldest Greek was pronounced as 10. There is another deity mentioned in the Rig Veda, which is one of the oldest sacred texts of Hinduism, known as Dyaus, which on some occasions can also be called Dyaisa. The similarity between this deity and the figures of Dipater di Hesita, as well as Jupiter, is quite evident and easily perceptible. It's quite curious to reflect on how, despite the geographical proximity between Greece and Italy, which would make it easier to imagine a dialogue between the two cultures, India is a considerable distance away. This reality, however, should not lead to the assumption that the elements that characterize the culture, religious traditions, and gods worshipped in India have nothing to do with the deities worshipped in Greece or Italy. On the contrary, it is essential to realize that the historical trajectory of these regions of Europe is deeply and intrinsically intertwined with the evolution of Indian history. Clear evidence of this connection is the similarity between the languages spoken in these areas. Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, the classical language that makes up the Rig Veda texts, are all classified as Indo-European languages. This indicates that they originate from the same common linguistic ancestor, thus highlighting a broader interrelationship between these distant cultures, which, despite geographical barriers, share linguistic and historical roots. To better illustrate this idea, we can consider Latin as an enlightening example. The Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and French languages, among others, have their roots and descendants directly linked to Latin. The word mãe in Portuguese corresponds to the word mother in English, which is quite evident and undeniable. In Spanish, the word used to designate a mother is madre. Similarly, the Italian language also uses the term madre to refer to the same concept. However, when we analyze the French language, we see that the corresponding word for the same idea, which is mother, is mère. It's interesting to note these similarities and differences between languages, especially when it comes to basic vocabulary related to the family. In Spanish, the word used to refer to the father is padre, while in Italian, the term is also padre. In French, the corresponding word is père. On the other hand, considering Latin, which can be seen as the language that gave rise to these other Romance languages, the words for mother and father are, respectively, mater and pater. Thus, we can observe a lexical consanguinity between these languages, reflecting the common roots they share with regard to the terms that designate the progenitors. The word mother in different languages reveals an interesting pattern of similarity that goes back to the linguistic roots of different cultures. For example, in Latin, the word for mother is mater. In Greek, we find meter, while in ancient Persian the form used is mato and, in Sanskrit, the corresponding word is mater. Likewise, the word father also has a similar configuration in the same languages. In Latin it is pater, in Greek it remains as pater, in ancient Persian it is pitar, and in Sanskrit it is also said pitar. This constancy in the names of mother and father throughout the different languages shows a clear family connection between the languages and suggests a common ancestor. Furthermore, just as the Latin languages have their origins in a common linguistic trunk, which is Latin, this shared origin explains, to a certain extent, the manifestation of these remarkable similarities that we observe. All the languages that belong to the Indo-European language family share the origin of an ancestral language that is common to all of them. The challenge that arises in this context is that the ancestor in question is extremely remote in terms of time, which makes the situation of identifying it and describing its particular characteristics quite complex and challenging, doesn't it? As far as the Latin language is concerned, it is possible to observe, both documentarily and materially, through various texts that have managed to withstand the passage of time, the significant changes that this language has experienced throughout its long historical trajectory. These transformations reflect the linguistic and cultural variations that have influenced Latin in different periods, highlighting the evolution that has become noticeable over time. We make available a variety of texts dating from the 1st century to the present, including works belonging to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, among others. This gives us the opportunity to observe the transformations of Latin over the centuries, starting, for example, at the time of the famous orator Cicero and continuing through to the period of Camões' writings, culminating in the contemporary form of Portuguese that we know today. In this way, we can see how language gradually evolves over time. However, when it comes to languages from ancient times, such as Latin, ancient Greek, ancient Persian and Sanskrit, the situation is different, since we don't have such complete and beautiful records that can be compared to more recent languages. For example, we can see a path of evolution in Greek, starting with the Greek used in the New Testament, dating back to the 1st century. Then we can move on to the Greek of the philosopher Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century, and even reach the Greek of the Odyssey, a work dating back to the 6th century. However, when we try to go even further back in time in search of documents and written records of these languages, we soon realize that they are becoming scarce. What can be done is a hypothetical reconstruction of the oldest forms of these languages. It's important to emphasize that this reconstruction is feasible to a certain extent, since many of the variations and transformations that occur in a language over the centuries tend to follow patterns that can be considered predictable, don't they? You can search for information about Grimm's Law on the Glosskonaut channel, where you'll find an exceptional video that covers this topic in detail, which I highly recommend you watch. This will give you a more in-depth understanding of this specific process. However, in any case, based on reconstructionist proposals, researchers in this field have suggested for over 100 years that the common ancestral language that gave rise to Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit is a language that has been called Proto-Indo-European. This name was chosen because it is considered to be the primitive language of the Indo-European language group. However, it is essential to emphasize that this Proto-Indo-European language has no record evidence or concrete documentation to prove it. Historically speaking, the question that arises involves a reconstruction that is considered hypothetical and that is carried out on the basis of ancient texts, which were written in languages that belong to the Indo-European language group, as well as using specific methods used in linguistics and in areas related to the study of languages. Continuing this line of reasoning, it is plausible to state that the terms Jupiter and Deisig derive from the Proto-Indo-European name Deisa. In this context, it's important to note that the second part of this name is translated as father, something we already know. On the other hand, the first part of this term refers to a root that carries the meaning of sky, more precisely, the sky during the day. Thus, we can interpret that the meaning of all these gods, as it originates from this root, would be something close to Father of the Sky or Heavenly Father. Having established this understanding, we can focus specifically on the relationship between the names Zeus and God. For this reason, we have not delved into definitions or specific aspects of the word God up to this point. It's worth pointing out that Deus is a Portuguese word that has its origins in the Latin deus. However, it is important to emphasize that, in the Latin language, the term deus came to be used broadly, becoming a generic word that can be applied to various deities, not restricted to the concept of the Christian God, but encompassing the idea of any supreme being or deity venerated in different religious contexts. Jupiter does not refer to a name that can be considered proper, so we can say that it is something other than a name that uniquely identifies a person or entity. Jupiter is recognized as a deity, just like Neptune, isn't it? Neptune, who is known as a god of the sea in mythology, and Apollo, who is revered as a god of light, music, and prophecy, are both important divine figures in mythological tradition. Therefore, we can say that both Neptune and Apollo are considered gods in their respective contexts within the stories and beliefs that surround them. An analogous phenomenon to the one mentioned above occurs in the Sanskrit language, where the word deva, which has the same etymological origin, represents a concept that can be used to refer to any deity or celestial being. Finally, when specifically addressing the concept of God as described in the Bible, it is important to emphasize that the God mentioned in this context does not appear, in his initial narrative, within a framework of languages that belong to the Indo-European family, which is something to be carefully considered. In fact, he manifests himself within a context related to Afro-Asiatic languages, doesn't he? Another linguistic family, which stands out especially in the context of Hebrew, is the language related to this Semitic language. In this context, it's important to mention that the deity referred to has a specific name, which has already been discussed and analyzed here on our channel. However, he was also called in Hebrew by means of a broader expression, which refers to deities in general, known as the term El or, alternatively, Elohim. However, the devotees and followers of this god, right? The devotees of this divine being, at a certain point in the trajectory of civilization, established an interaction with the Greek language, and in this context, some of these faithful began to express themselves about this god using Greek. One of the expressions that was used to refer to this god in the Greek language was the word theos, which, in its literal translation, denotes the concept of divinity and, more broadly, can be considered a generic term to refer to what is sacred or divine. However, it's important to emphasize that this isn't the only word that could be used, is it? The word theos does not derive from the same etymological root as the word Zeus, even though at first glance this relationship might seem possible. This is an interesting observation, because we can often assume links between terms that aren't really valid. It's a different root, but what's really relevant is the fact that the narrative continued, and people began to discuss and share their opinions about this god. With regard to Latin, it's worth mentioning that when the Bible, which was initially written in Hebrew, was translated, this sacred text was finally translated into Latin. This translation took place within the context of the Christianization of the vast Roman Empire. In this process, the term chosen to replace the Hebrew Elohim and the Greek theos is the Latin word God. It is important to emphasize that within Christianity, the fundamental belief is that there is only one God. Therefore, the use of a proper name to refer to this God, as opposed to the designation of other gods, was seen as essentially unnecessary. In addition, there are other motivations that also relate to the question of piety and other reflections that have already been mentioned in a video I mentioned earlier, in which I discussed the proper denomination of the God who appears in the Bible. So, in essence, we can understand that this is how the word God, whose original meaning is a term of Latin origin that has a common root with the Greek Zeus, ended up establishing itself as almost a proper name for the deity mentioned in the Bible. Nowadays, many people say, for example, that they have faith in God, or that they consider God to be faithful, or that Jesus is the Son of God, without, however, feeling the need to clarify exactly which God they are referring to. In this way, it's important to point out that the term in question ended up being transformed into something that resembles a proper name, which is perfectly understandable, especially when we analyze this phenomenon within a context that is mostly Christian. Furthermore, it's clear that this transformation in spelling, which starts with a capital letter, emphasizes the relevance of the term. Now, by mentioning that I was experiencing certain issues that could radically alter the perception of narratives about the history of religions, I'm making it clear that this is a significant aspect of this discussion, right? What are the questions that are being mentioned? In fact, there are fundamentally two options. The first observation we can make is that none of the known religions began and developed in isolation, without contact or influence from other religious practices or cultures. It is quite common for people to believe that the different mythologies, such as Greek, Chinese, Norse and others, emerged in a complete and finalized form, with a coherent organization and copyright protection assigned to their respective creations and inventors. This perception is so ingrained that often, when they come across elements in the narratives of Greek mythology that resemble others in the stories of Indian mythology, many people feel an immediate impulse to question who plagiarized or copied whom, as if these mythologies were involved in a real legal dispute between contemporary authors of fantasy or science fiction literature, very similar to the copyright conflicts we see today. However, this assumption doesn't match the reality, which is quite different and, in fact, much more complex than that. All the religious traditions we know today have origins that are more remote than what we observe in their contemporary form. What's more, many of these religions have common roots and, over the centuries, have established and maintained interactions and relationships with each other, even after they have reached their apogee or developed, if we can put it that way. To illustrate this point, we can consider that the ancient Greeks, as well as the various Italic communities, have bequeathed to us, as already discussed, various cultural elements that are shared between them. It is therefore possible to see that, even in different contexts, cultural and religious influences are significantly intertwined. This includes, in fact, both the language you speak and various aspects related to religious beliefs and practices, doesn't it? In fact, if we consider that this group originated from a community that spoke an ancestral language that was their own, we can conclude that this community also had a distinct culture, can't we? At that moment, the individuals were engaged in a conversation, discussing various aspects, expressing opinions, and sharing their thoughts. In this way, they had a series of concepts and formed ideas that were a vital part of the dialogue between them. Therefore, if a nation makes a mistake, it also ends up losing not only important concepts, but also significant aspects of its culture and other related elements. However, as I've already mentioned, the Greeks, like the peoples of Italy, have managed to inherit various cultural aspects that are common among their ancestors, as well as influences from the Indo-European peoples. Despite these inheritances, each of these groups has continued this heritage in a way that stands out and differs from the others. These cultural groups have managed to develop relatively independently, which has resulted in the creation of distinct cultures that, although they share certain similarities, also have significant differences. However, it is important to emphasize that the history of interaction between these peoples did not end at this initial stage. In fact, there was no definitive separation that resulted in their total estrangement. On the contrary, over the course of time, these peoples have met on several occasions, maintaining continuous and dynamic interactions. A notable example of these interactions is the involvement of the Romans, one of the peoples belonging to the Italic group, who, at a certain historical moment, even brought these other peoples closer to themselves, integrating them in different ways into their own culture. Reading the texts of Homer, Greek tragedies, Greek philosophers in the education of adults and children in Rome, then the culture of the Roman elite was strongly influenced by Greek culture and, consequently, the way the Romans thought about Jupiter ended up incorporating various characteristics that developed specifically in Greece, right, in relation to the Greek Zeus. So Zeus and Jupiter have this original closeness because they come from the same Proto-Indo-European root. But then, throughout history, new contacts were made and new influences occurred, and this connection, right, this mythological religious cultural flow with elements passing through here and there, becoming the route from Greece to Rome and from Rome to Greece, continued for centuries and centuries and even more. This flow was not a simple one-way road. In fact, what we have historically is a real extremely complex circuit. The tangle that includes peoples and cultures from Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, and India is an overwhelming cultural dynamism, impossible to follow completely, and we can only obtain clues about these cultural contacts and cultural and religious, cultic, and mythological transformations from the documentation that has survived. To illustrate an idea that I find particularly intriguing about the subject in question, I would like to mention that Hermes is the deity in Greek mythology who is most closely linked to dynamism, speed, movement on the roads, and the protection of travelers. Therefore, I will choose to present an image that relates to this god in an interesting and peculiar way, because the image I have chosen is that of Hermanubis. This representation brings a curious aspect to our understanding of Hermes. This was a deity resulting from the fusion of Greek and Egyptian cultures, who enjoyed great popularity in Egypt, especially during the period when this territory was under Roman rule. This divine being is a figure that unites characteristics and attributes of different gods, such as Hermes, who is known as the messenger of the gods in Greek mythology, Anubis, who is a deity in Egyptian mythology associated with the afterlife and mummification, and Mercury, who has a similar role in Roman mythology as a messenger and god of commerce. In addition, he incorporates traits from other divine entities, broadening his complexity and the facets of his nature. What is happening with this combination of divine characteristics? Tell me, are you right? The question raised refers to concepts that can be related to different belief systems and religious traditions, namely Greek, Egyptian, or Roman mythologies. Each of these mythologies presents a distinct set of gods, myths, and practices. For example, Greek mythology is known for its stories of gods such as Zeus and Athena, while Egyptian mythology has deities such as Ra and Isis. On the other hand, Roman mythology, which is often influenced by Greek mythology, includes gods such as Jupiter and Venus. Therefore, identifying whether something belongs to one of these mythologies requires carefully analyzing the elements in question and understanding the origins and historical contexts of each of them. So, to be more precise, what is being mentioned is not restricted to Greek mythology, nor to Egyptian or Roman mythology. It's possible that it's a combination of all these aspects, isn't it? It's important to emphasize that, strictly speaking, and this is an essential question to be addressed, it can't be said that there are mythologies that can be classified as Greek, Egyptian, or Roman. Is that clear? What really exists throughout the trajectory of humanity are a variety of cults, beliefs, narratives, and artifacts that spread and underwent transformations over time. This reality is extremely complex and confusing, and in order to make this process easier to understand, we have arbitrarily developed categories that we consider artificial and which we call Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and so on. These categorizations are applied to phenomena that, in reality, were never intended to be integrated into a whole that resembles a coherent, cohesive, and self-sufficient system, nor protected by copyright or grouped under any other specific label. Understood. It seems that we are dealing with a dialogue where questions are mentioned. So, the first question has been presented and now we're on to the second, right? Returning to the discussion about the particular connection between Zeus and God, we can state the following. These gods, who in essence are referred to by the same name, represent the same divinity, the same supreme being. Therefore, we can say that Zeus and Jupiter are, in fact, the same deity, thus possessing a number of similarities that were already emphasized at the beginning of this video, correct? In texts from ancient Greece, as well as those from ancient Rome, both Zeus and Jupiter are described as the figure of a sovereign god, who reigns over all the other gods. These deities are often associated with the symbol of the thunderbolt, which is closely linked to the image of the eagle and the oak tree, as well as appearing as protagonists in narratives that are almost identical to each other. There is even mention by some ancient authors who directly state that the entity the Greeks referred to as Zeus was, in fact, the same entity considered by the Romans under the name of Jupiter. However, when we analyze the relationship between Zeus and God, specifically in comparison with the god described in the Rig Veda, the sacred text of the Indian tradition, we realize that there are practically no more significant relationships between these figures, except for the fact that they share a similar name. Of the gods mentioned, it is indeed correct to say that they are often referred to as Father and have a connection with heaven. However, the similarities between them practically end at this specific point. Therefore, having a similar name in no way implies that these gods are actually the same deity. An interesting example to mention is the god Zeus, who shares the same etymological origin as the word Tyr, which refers to the Norse god. However, it is important to emphasize that, despite this linguistic connection, Zeus and Tyr have very few elements in common, especially in terms of the characteristics, histories, and cultural contexts in which they are inserted. On the other hand, several ancient authors claimed that the Egyptian god Amun was, in fact, the same as Zeus. Furthermore, they argued that Tinia, a god from Etruscan mythology, was also equal to Zeus, as was the Phoenician god Baal-Chamim, who was also associated with Zeus. However, it's important to note that, in reality, none of these names mentioned have any direct relationship with the figure of Zeus. However, it is important to note that none of these names are related to each other, which is why there are gods who, despite having similar names, are not identified as the same deity. At the same time, there are also gods who, despite having different names, are recognized as the same divine entity. To enrich this discussion, we can also add a final layer of complexity, which I'll explore at this point before we reach a conclusion. What I mean is that it's not enough to say that Zeus and Jupiter represent the same divinity, because this simplification is inadequate. What's more, you can't categorically state that Zeus and Zeus are the same deity either, because this idea, although it seems logical at first glance, isn't as simple as it seems, right? I reiterate that it is not correct to state in a simplistic way that Zeus and Zeus represent the same divinity. My intention is to make it clear what I am expressing. What I'm trying to say is exactly right, isn't it? The Zeus portrayed in Homer's narratives, especially in the stories related to the Trojan War, is presented in a very different way compared to the representation of this same god in the hymns attributed to Orpheus. While the Homeric Zeus is characterized by his more concrete and active presence in the events and lives of mortals, the Zeus of the Orphic hymns takes on a form that can be considered much more abstract and symbolic, standing out for his duality and deeper, spiritual meanings. Therefore, this significant difference in representations shows how the same mythological character can be interpreted in different ways over time and in different literary contexts. The Zeus described in the works of Homer and Orpheus have distinct characteristics and aspects compared to the Zeus discussed in the philosophical writings of Aristotle. In fact, the representation of the Greek god in epic literature and mythology contrasts considerably with the way he is interpreted and discussed in the Aristotelian philosophical context. These two types of representations offer varying views of the deity, revealing how ancient Greek culture conceived of Zeus' power and attributes in different spheres of knowledge and expression. Therefore, continuing this line of reasoning, we are referring to exactly the same name and staying within Greek mythology. The discussion about the possibility of determining whether we are talking about the same god or not, whether we are talking about the same entity or not, and whether we are referring to the same being or not, is already an extremely complex and challenging question to answer. So this question about the equivalence between X and Y, or whether Zeus can be considered the same god as the Christian conception of God, proves to be quite complicated and, for some, even impossible to answer objectively and conclusively. This is akin to asking whether Pope Francis and the Eye of Rehberg are really the same person, which only reinforces the difficulty in finding definitive answers to such comparisons. Answering this question is considerably simpler, since the referent associated with these names refers to something that is concrete and palpable, in other words, something that can be physically perceived and touched. This provides greater clarity in understanding what is being addressed, making the task of providing an answer easier. In a specific circumstance, we might find a group of individuals who refer to a particular person using the name Rory Bergelow, while on the other hand, there are other individuals who choose to call him Papa. This difference in referring to the same figure reveals the variety of ways in which people can recognize and designate someone who occupies a prominent position, in this case, the religious leadership known as the papacy. Francisco, when we want to refer to a specific person, there is the possibility of using a photograph to check that we are referring to the same person. In this way, by showing the picture, we can check that the referent of the word being used in a conversation is in fact the same for both speakers. A practical example would be the use of the word table. If one person mentions this word and the other does too, we can show an image of this object or even the physical object itself so that both interlocutors can ensure that they are using the word table to refer to the same thing, even though in some situations they may use different names. However, when dealing with entities such as God, who in different cultures and mythologies is known by various other names, such as Zeus, Elohim, Shiva, and Saturn, the question arises of how to make an effective comparison between these various signifiers. In this case, it will be more complex to establish a visual parameter, as we do with objects or people, to ensure that we are talking about the same concept or transcendent entity, because these names can be representations of deities in different traditions and cultural contexts, making it more difficult to verify that all parties involved are referring to the same figure or idea. Therefore, discussing this comparison would require a more detailed approach that takes into account the nuances of history. This particular subject is something that really lies completely outside the boundaries and scope of historical research that is carried out in the academic environment in a scientific manner, isn't it? I can carry out a variety of activities, such as answering questions, providing explanations on various topics, helping with writing texts, offering study tips and more. I'm here to help answer questions and provide useful information, always endeavoring to make the conversation relevant and informative. If you have a specific need or topic in mind, feel free to ask. Claiming that certain people, referred to as so-and-so, in the specific historical context of X or Y, believed whether or not God A and God B were essentially the same entity, is correct? This question can be approached from a historical perspective. However, if you were to question whether these people were, in fact, genuine or whether they were acting correctly within their respective historical contexts, I would feel compelled to ask you to go back 2 steps, revisiting the beginning of the video. Alternatively, I would suggest that you seek the guidance of a theological expert, such as a theologian, a Babylorixer, or an imam, who can offer informed opinions in the field of theology, as well as in the dogmatic traditions pertinent to this subject. However, as far as historical analysis is concerned, it is important to emphasize that, as a historian, I cannot provide a definitive answer. Both God and Zeus refer to the same divinity in different contexts. However, in short, it is important to emphasize that the terms Zeus and God are actually names that have a linguistic and cultural relationship with each other. This relationship highlights in a very fascinating way the inherent complexity and dynamic nature that characterizes the history of religious beliefs throughout the ages. In this way, we can see the intersection of these concepts and how they intertwine within the development of spiritual traditions. However, this doesn't imply that Zeus and God are actually the same deity in reality, does it? The discussion we've had so far, with all the exchange of ideas that has taken place, doesn't necessarily relate to or lead to a conclusion about the true essence of what is considered sacred. Do you agree? It's not just about discussing the nature of God or the gods themselves, but actually about understanding how the concept of the sacred has been conceived, visualized, structured, and developed throughout the trajectory of human history, isn't it? A very special thank you for attending, and I hope to see you again at our next presentations.